From the News Channel 5 network, this is Inside Politics.
Hello, everyone. I'm News Channel 5's political analyst Pat Nolan. Welcome to Inside Politics. Next week on Tuesday, September 5th, it'll be less than 50 days or 7 weeks before the November 3rd general presidential election. Dr. John Weil, a longtime political science professor and dean of the Honors College at Middle Tennessee State University, is one of those watching the race very closely. He's our guest on Inside Politics this week. Dr. Weil, welcome back. We always enjoy having you on the program, so thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I always enjoy being here.
Let's talk a little bit about maybe the biggest story of the week that's come out. Everybody's got a book on the Trump White House and the Trump administration, it appears. But this book that called Rage, that Bob Woodward of Watergate fame has come out with, seems to have perhaps the chance to have an impact on the race. He did a series of taped interviews with the president, long interviews. One of them happened back in the winter before anybody died from COVID-19. The president said in the interview he'd been told the virus was very deadly, highly contagious, much more so than the flu. Yet for the weeks since then, and even to today, he tends to downplay the flu. He tends to downplay the virus. He seems to say that he's doing that because he doesn't want to alarm or cause panic among the public. Is this going to be like the Watergate tapes? Is this going to be one of those things that Donald Trump's going to have to deal with for the rest of the campaign, and not in a good way?
Well, as you mentioned, it's one of about half a dozen books that have been out just in the last 2 weeks or so. It does, partly because of the tapes, it seems to be the one having the biggest impact. I think there's a difference between, telling people not to panic and sort of hiding the truth from them. And it appears as though Trump has erred on the latter side in this situation.
He also seems to be not worried about the fact that in 2018 he said a lot about caravans, and early on he's been trying to stoke some fears about the end of the suburbs if Biden's elected. So his definition of panic may be different than I think what most people think they are, and what he said has certainly been different than what he told Bob Woodward.
Well, and if you look at, I guess it was just last night or perhaps the night before in Michigan, the Trump rally basically said, I'm not trying to alarm the people. And then he went on and said, but, if you elect Biden, there's going to be crime in the streets. Your houses are not going to be safe. Our military is going to deteriorate, and we're going to hell in a handbasket, basically.
The president's also been on the defensive over some remarks that he allegedly made, for at least through anonymous sources, that our American war dead were suckers and losers, somewhat similar to what he said publicly about John McCain back when the senator was still alive. Is the president going to have a credibility gap? Is this an issue that's going to stick around throughout the rest of the campaign?
The problem, of course, is, if it's true, it's about as damning as you can get. I just got through at MTSU this morning participating in a 9/11 commemoration, and certainly all of us, I hope, respect and honor the sacrifices that have been made. The problem, of course, is we have confirmation that people have said this, but the people themselves have not publicly identified themselves, and I'm not sure I would want to identify myself in those circumstances either. But yes, there's definitely a credibility gap. I remember, and date myself here, but when I was in high school, they used to talk about Lyndon Johnson having a credibility gap. And I think it's nothing like that Trump currently has.
It probably also ought to be said that the President Trump is the same candidate back in 2016 that had a tape come out with some very salacious and controversial comments about women that damaged his campaign for a while. But a few weeks later, he was elected president despite it. So can he overcome these kind of problems? He did before.
Well, going back to the only poll that's going to count is the one that happens on Election Day. The reason to suspect that he may not bounce back quite as well as he did last time is, first, he's much more a known quantity. It was easier to say, here's going to be the person who's going to solve all our problems before we knew, here's somebody who's going to be presidential, before he was actually in the president's office. And the second thing is political movement in the polls doesn't seem to be affected much one way or the other. There's a 38 to 42% that seem baked in as pro-Trump, and there's probably about as many, maybe a few more right now, who are sort of on the never Trump side. And then you have, a group of maybe 6 to 8% who still are saying they're undecided. There's always a chance that they're being a little more politically correct than they would admit to, and they really favor Trump and just don't want to tell pollsters that. But in terms of the polls, they've been very steady from before the convention on through now.
President Trump's also been trying to make a difference with his law and order theme, that the unrest we see in the country, mostly over the George Floyd the killing, he says it's because the left is doing it and Trump is doing it and the Democrats are doing it. Is that issue working for him? It doesn't seem to have moved the polls.
Well, I mean, it's law and order. If you think of what government does, probably two of the primary functions are to protect us both against domestic and foreign enemies. So as an issue, it's a very important issue. On the other hand, this law and order problem is happening on Trump's watch. So it's almost as though he would have us to say, well, this is happening, but it's always the fault of the Democratic governor or the Democratic mayor or whatever. So I don't know. I mean, I think there were candidates that you could much more easily make the case that Trump is trying to make than Biden and Harris. But neither of them impressed me, as sort of bomb throwers. Or Biden certainly has been very clear that he does not favor violence as an approach to the problems that we're having in policing.
Biden does seem to be carrying a pretty consistent 7-8 point lead in the national polls. Of course, that's the popular vote. That's not the battleground states are much closer. That being the situation, we have a number of states that are in the battlegrounds that were there before: Florida, Michigan, North Carolina, Pennsylvania. Well, we've got some states that have always been Republican states: Arizona, Georgia, Ohio. They rarely vote Democratic. Minnesota is a Democratic state, but may be voting Republican this time. If this was a football game, what end of the field are we playing on? Are we playing on Trump's end of the field or Biden's end of the field?
Well, I think what's interesting, and I'm not responding as directly perhaps as I should, but one of the interesting things about what's happened in the past week or two is that Trump seems to have lost, at least temporarily, his ability to set the agenda. The books sort of have knocked him off course. Some of the events that are happening, the fires in California, the hurricanes that have hit Louisiana and elsewhere on the coast, have drawn a little bit of attention away from, he's not necessarily the top lead story every night, and as a result, he hasn't quite been able to set the narrative.
Dr. John Vile of Middle Tennessee State University, political science professor and dean of the Honors College there, is our guest. We're talking presidential politics. Back to continue our conversation after this break.